There are some moments that can never be undone, some decisions that seal your fate before you even realize what's happening. August 17th, 2018 was one of those days for Brandon Mitchell, and the choice he made 200 feet inside Shadow Ridge Cave would become a nightmare that haunted everyone who tried to save him. What started as a summer adventure with friends turned into 9 hours of unimaginable horror, and if you think being stuck in a tight space is your worst fear, wait until you hear what happened when Brandon went in head first. Welcome to Cave Stories, where we examine real cave accidents and the critical mistakes that turned adventure into tragedy. Brandon Mitchell was a 22-year-old senior at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, Tennessee, studying mechanical engineering. He was athletic, adventurous, and always seeking a new adrenaline rush. Rock climbing, hiking, mountain biking, you name it, Brandon had tried it all. But what about caving? This was something new on his to-do list. His best friend, Caleb Rodriguez, who had explored 6 different cave systems over the past 2 years, had been talking to Brandon for months about the incredible underground world. Crystal formations, the echo of water droplets in massive chambers, the thrill of passing through passages few had seen. Brandon was hooked on the idea before he even set foot in the cave. 2 days before the incident, on August 15th, Caleb mentioned Shadow Ridge Cave during a barbecue party at Brandon's apartment. It was a little-known cave system located about 45 minutes outside Knoxville, rarely visited by tourists or even experienced cave explorers. Caleb explained that the main passage was simple, perfect for beginners. However, there were also some side passages not shown on the map that added mystery and excitement. Brandon's eyes lit up. This was exactly the kind of adventure he craved. They decided to go that Saturday, August 17th. Caleb invited his friend Jessica Palmer, a 23-year-old nurse who had never been caving but was curious about trying something new. Jessica was hesitant at first. The idea of crawling through tight, dark spaces made her uncomfortable, but Caleb assured her that the main passage was wide enough and that they'd take it slow. Plus, having 3 people meant they were following the golden rule of caving: never go with fewer than 3 people. If something went wrong, one person could stay with the victim while the other went for help. But here's where the first critical mistake was made. None of them were truly prepared for what they were about to do. Brandon had 0 caving experience. Jessica had 0 caving experience. Only Caleb had been in caves before, and even his 6 trips didn't make him an expert. They had no formal training, no knowledge of cave rescue procedures, and only a basic understanding of the risks involved. They were relying entirely on Caleb's limited experience and a lot of overconfidence. On the morning of August 17th, they loaded up Caleb's Jeep with their gear. And when I say gear, I mean the absolute bare minimum. Each of them had a headlamp. Brandon brought an extra LED flashlight, and Caleb packed a 50-foot rope, just in case. They wore jeans, t-shirts, and old sneakers. No helmets, no knee pads, no gloves, no emergency supplies, no first aid kit, and no communication devices. They didn't tell anyone specifically where they were going, just that they'd be back by evening. This was caving mistake number 1: inadequate preparation and no emergency plan. The drive to Shadow Ridge Cave was filled with excitement and nervous energy. Jessica kept asking questions about what to expect, and Caleb did his best to reassure her. Brandon, meanwhile, was watching YouTube videos on his phone about caving techniques, trying to absorb as much information as possible in the short time they had. He watched videos of people squeezing through impossibly tight passages, navigating vertical shafts, and exploring underground rivers. It all looked thrilling, and Brandon couldn't wait to experience it himself. They arrived at the trailhead around 2 p.m. The entrance to Shadow Ridge Cave was about a 20-minute hike through dense forest. The trail was unmarked, but Caleb had been there before and knew the way. As they hiked, the temperature dropped slightly and the air became humid. You could feel the presence of the cave before you even saw it. that distinct coolness that seeps out from underground. The entrance was a wide, dark opening in the side of a limestone cliff, about 6 feet high and 8 feet wide. Water trickled out from the cave mouth, creating a small stream that wound down the hillside. It looked inviting, not at all like the foreboding entrance to a death trap. Brandon stood at the threshold, peering into the darkness, his heart pounding with anticipation. They turned on their headlamps and stepped inside. The main passage was exactly as Caleb had described, wide, relatively flat, and easy to navigate. The walls were covered in flowstone formations, and small stalactites hung from the ceiling like stone icicles. The sound of dripping water echoed through the chamber, creating an almost musical quality to the silence. Jessica relaxed a bit, realizing it wasn't as scary as she'd imagined. Brandon was in awe, his engineer's mind marveling at the geological processes that had created this underground cathedral over millions of years. They moved deeper into the cave, following the main passage. Caleb led the way, with Jessica in the middle and Brandon bringing up the rear. The passage gradually narrowed and the ceiling lowered, forcing them to crouch and eventually crawl on their hands and knees. The discomfort was part of the adventure, and they pressed on, their headlamps cutting through the darkness. After about 45 minutes and roughly 200 feet of crawling, they reached a point where the main passage opened up into a small chamber, maybe 10 feet in diameter. This was a good spot to rest, Caleb said. They sat on the rocky floor, catching their breath and drinking water from the bottles they'd brought. Brandon was exhilarated. This was everything he'd hoped for, and more. But as he swept his flashlight around the chamber, he noticed something Caleb hadn't mentioned before. There were 2 other passages leading out of the chamber. Caleb pointed to the one on the left, explaining that it led back toward the entrance through a slightly different route. But it was the passage on the right that caught Brandon's attention. It was smaller, darker, and had a kind of mysterious allure. "Where does that one go?" Brandon asked. Caleb shrugged. "I've never been down there. It's not on any of the maps I've seen. Probably just a dead end, or maybe it connects to another part of the system. Either way, it's not for beginners. It looks really tight." But Brandon was intrigued. He'd come here for adventure, and the idea of exploring an unmapped passage was too tempting to resist. "Come on," he said. "Let's just check it out for a few minutes. If it gets too tight, we'll turn back." Jessica immediately objected. "I don't think that's a good idea. We should stick to what we know." But Brandon was persistent, and even Caleb seemed curious. They debated for a few minutes, and eventually Caleb gave in. "All right, but just a quick look. If it gets sketchy, we turn around immediately. No arguments." This was caving mistake number 2. Deviating from the planned route and entering an unmapped passage without proper knowledge or equipment. This single decision would change everything. Brandon volunteered to go first. He was the most eager, and frankly, he wanted to prove to himself that he could handle the challenge. He approached the opening of the right-hand passage, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The passage started out about 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, requiring a low crawl. The walls were smooth limestone, worn down by water over countless centuries. It looked manageable. He got down on his stomach and started inching forward. The passage was tight, but not unbearably so. He could move his arms freely and push himself along with his legs. Behind him, Caleb and Jessica waited at the entrance, watching his light disappear into the darkness. Every few seconds, Brandon would call back, updating them on what he was seeing. "It's tight, but doable. The passage curves to the right up ahead. I think it might open up soon." As Brandon crawled deeper, the passage did indeed curve to the right, and then it began to slope slightly downward. This was when he should have turned back. A downward slope in a tight passage is a major red flag. If the passage continued to narrow, getting back out would be exponentially harder because you'd be fighting gravity. But Brandon didn't know this. He was operating on enthusiasm and adrenaline, not experience. After about 30 feet of crawling, Brandon reached a section that cavers who later investigated would call the Devil's Squeeze. It was a narrow compression in the passage where the walls pinched together, creating a keyhole-shaped opening about 18 inches high and 10 inches wide. To Brandon, it looked like a challenge, a test of his determination. He could see that the passage seemed to continue on the other side, and his curiosity overrode his caution. He exhaled completely, collapsing his chest to make himself as small as possible, and pushed his head and shoulders through the opening. It was an incredibly tight fit, and for a moment he felt a flash of panic. But then he was through, his upper body emerging into a slightly larger space on the other side. He felt a rush of accomplishment. He'd done it. He'd conquered the Devil's Squeeze. But here's the critical thing Brandon didn't understand. Squeezing through a tight passage headfirst is dangerous, because if the passage continues to narrow, you might not be able to back out. Your shoulders are the widest part of your upper body, and once they're through a tight spot, reversing that movement while crawling backward is incredibly difficult. Experienced cavers know this rule. When exploring an unmapped passage, always go feet first. That way, if you get stuck, your strongest muscles, your legs, can push you back out. Going head first was caving mistake number 3, and it would prove to be fatal. Brandon called back to his friends. "I made it through a tight spot. The passage keeps going. I'm just going to go a little further." Caleb yelled back, "Be careful, man. If it gets any tighter, come back." Brandon acknowledged and continued forward. Just beyond the Devil's Squeeze, the passage took another downward turn, this time at about a 30-degree angle. The walls began to narrow again, forming what's known as an hourglass compression. At the top, where Brandon's head and chest were, the passage was about 12 inches wide. But as it angled downward, it tapered to just 8 inches at the narrowest point before widening slightly again further down. Brandon didn't see this narrowing because his body was blocking his view. All he knew was that the passage continued, and he was committed to seeing where it led. He pushed forward, exhaling deeply to compress his chest. He felt the walls tighten around his ribcage, but he kept pushing, assuming he'd break through to a wider section any second. But instead of breaking through, he got stuck. Not just a little stuck, but completely, utterly wedged. His torso was jammed between the rock walls, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't move forward or backward. His arms were pinned, one underneath his body and the other pushed awkwardly behind him by an outcrop of rock. His chest was compressed so tightly that he could barely breathe, and worst of all, he was angled downward, with his head lower than his feet. He was upside down in a position that would prove medically catastrophic. Brandon's first instinct was disbelief. "This can't be happening. I just need to adjust my position and I'll be fine." He tried to twist his body, to create even the smallest amount of wiggle room, but the limestone walls held him like a vice. The rock was unforgiving, ancient, and immovable. His breathing became rapid and shallow, partly because of the chest compression and partly because panic was beginning to set in. He tried to call out to Caleb, but his voice came out weak and strained. The tight space was crushing the air from his lungs with every attempted breath. In the chamber behind him, Caleb and Jessica were growing concerned. It had been almost 5 minutes since they'd last heard from Brandon, and that wasn't like him. He'd been calling back updates every 30 seconds or so, but now there was only silence. Caleb called into the passage. "Brandon, you good, man?" No response. He called again, louder this time. "Brandon, talk to me, bro." Still nothing. Jessica's face went pale. "Something's wrong," she whispered. Caleb made a decision. He got down on his stomach and started crawling into the passage, following the same route Brandon had taken. Jessica stayed at the entrance, her heart pounding. The passage felt even tighter than it had looked when Brandon went in, and Caleb had to really compress himself to make progress. His headlamp bounced off the limestone walls as he crawled, and he could see the fresh scuff marks where Brandon's shoes had scraped along the rock. He followed these marks like a trail of breadcrumbs, each one bringing him closer to his friend. When Caleb reached the Devil's Squeeze, he understood immediately why Brandon had been so excited to get through it. It looked like the kind of challenge that would make a great story later. But Caleb was bigger than Brandon, broader in the shoulders and chest, and he wasn't sure he could fit through. He called out again, "Brandon, can you hear me?" And this time he got a response. A weak, terrified voice echoed back through the rock. "Caleb, I'm stuck. I can't move. I can't breathe right. Help me." Those 3 words, "help me," sent a jolt of fear through Caleb's entire body. In all his caving experience, he'd never encountered a real emergency. He'd dealt with tight squeezes, disorientation, even a sprained ankle once, but never someone truly stuck. He tried to keep his voice calm. "Okay, buddy. Don't panic. I'm gonna figure this out. Can you back up at all?" Brandon's response was immediate and desperate. "No, I've been trying. I can't move anything. My arms are pinned. My chest. It's so tight. I can't get enough air." Caleb assessed the situation. He couldn't get through the Devil's Squeeze to reach Brandon, which meant he couldn't physically help him from this position. And even if he could reach him, what would he do? He didn't have the tools or knowledge to extract someone from a tight passage. The only option was to get help. Real help. Professional help. He called back to Brandon. "Listen to me. I'm going back to get rescue. Jessica's here. We're going to get you out. Just stay calm and try to breathe slowly." Brandon's voice cracked. "Don't leave me here. Please don't leave me." But Caleb had no choice. Every minute that passed with Brandon stuck in that position was dangerous. He needs oxygen. He needs medical attention. And he needs experts who know how to handle this. Caleb backed out of the passage as quickly as he could, the rough limestone scraping his elbows and knees. When he emerged into the chamber, Jessica took one look at his face and knew it was bad. "We need to get out of here. We need to call 911. They moved through the cave faster than they'd ever moved before, crawling and scrambling back toward the entrance. Jessica was crying, terrified for Brandon. Caleb was running through scenarios in his head, trying to figure out how bad this really was. When they finally burst out of the cave entrance into the late afternoon sunlight, Caleb pulled out his phone. No signal. He'd expected this. Most caves are in remote areas with poor cell coverage, but it was still frustrating. They had to get to higher ground. They ran up the trail, checking their phones every few seconds. Finally, about 5 minutes from the cave entrance, Caleb got one bar of signal. He immediately dialed 911. The call connected and a dispatcher answered. 911, what's your emergency? Caleb's words tumbled out in a rush. My friend is stuck in a cave, Shadow Ridge Cave off Highway 25. He's wedged in tight, can't move, having trouble breathing. We need help immediately. The dispatcher remained calm, asking for details. How long has he been stuck? About 20 minutes, maybe more. How far into the cave? About 200 feet from the entrance, then another 30 or 40 feet into a side passage. Is he injured? I don't know. He says he can't breathe well. He's stuck at a downward angle. The dispatcher told them to stay on the line while she contacted the local cave rescue team. Within minutes, the wheels were in motion. The Tennessee Cave Rescue Team was alerted, and Captain Frank Morrison, a 45-year-old veteran with over 20 years of cave rescue experience, was designated as the incident commander. Frank had seen it all: broken bones, hypothermia, drowning, psychological breakdowns. But cases involving someone stuck in a tight passage always made his stomach drop. Time was never on your side in those situations. By 4:45 p.m., just over an hour after Brandon had entered the side passage, the first rescue vehicles arrived at the trailhead. Captain Morrison, along with Dr. Helen Carter, a cave rescue specialist and emergency physician, and a team of 6 trained cave rescuers, geared up and prepared to enter Shadow Ridge Cave. They brought portable ventilation equipment, communication devices, medical supplies, and specialized extraction tools, including small hydraulic jacks, rock hammers, and chisels. Caleb and Jessica met them at the cave entrance, both of them exhausted and terrified. Caleb briefed Captain Morrison on exactly where Brandon was stuck and what the passage looked like. Morrison listened carefully, asking detailed questions. Was Brandon able to talk when you left him? Yes, but he sounded weak. Could you see him at all? No, there's a tight squeeze between us. I couldn't get through. Morrison nodded. This was going to be complicated. The rescue team entered the cave at 5:15 p.m. They moved efficiently but carefully, their experience showing in every movement. When they reached the chamber where the side passage branched off, Morrison made an assessment. The passage was too tight for most of his team members. Only the smallest and most experienced rescuer, a woman named Amy Chen, who was just 5 feet 2 inches and had done dozens of confined space rescues, would be able to navigate the Devil's Squeeze. The plan was for Amy to make contact with Brandon, assess his medical condition, and figure out exactly how he was positioned. Amy prepared herself mentally and physically. She knew that seeing someone stuck in a passage could be deeply disturbing, both for the victim and the rescuer. She stripped down her gear to the bare minimum: a helmet, a headlamp, and a small medical kit. She couldn't afford any extra bulk. Then she entered the passage, crawling on her stomach, just as Brandon and Caleb had done before her. When Amy reached the Devil's Squeeze, she paused. It was even tighter than she'd expected. She could feel her own pulse quicken, a natural response to entering such a confined space. But she controlled her breathing and pushed through, compressing her chest and shoulders. It took her almost 3 minutes of careful maneuvering, but she made it through to the other side. And that's when she saw Brandon's feet. They were about 10 feet ahead of her, sticking up at an awkward angle, the soles of his muddy sneakers illuminated by her headlamp. Amy called out, "Brandon, can you hear me? My name is Amy. I'm with the rescue team. We're going to get you out of here." Brandon's response was weak but audible. "Please, help me. Can't breathe. Hurts so much." Amy crawled forward until she could just barely touch Brandon's ankles. The passage was so tight that she couldn't get beside him or see his upper body. All she could do was reach his lower legs. She shone her light down the passage, trying to see how he was positioned, and what she saw made her heart sink. Brandon's body disappeared into an hourglass. His head was lower than his feet, maybe at a 25 or 30-degree downward angle, and he'd been in this position for over 90 minutes now. Amy knew immediately that this was a life-threatening situation. Being inverted, stuck upside down, causes blood to pool in the upper body and head. The heart has to work much harder to circulate blood against gravity. Blood pressure increases in the brain, which can cause disorientation, unconsciousness, and eventually, if left too long, brain damage or death. Add to that the chest compression, which was restricting Brandon's ability to breathe, and you have a recipe for disaster. The medical term is positional asphyxia, and it can kill within hours. Amy radioed back to Captain Morrison. "I've made contact. He's alive but in critical condition. He's inverted at approximately 30 degrees, complete thoracic compression, severe respiratory distress. We need to get him out immediately." Morrison's response was grim. Understood. What's the passage configuration? Amy described what she was seeing. The hourglass compression, the angle, the rock formations. Morrison and Dr. Carter discussed options. They could try to pull Brandon out by his feet, but without proper leverage and with his body wedged so tightly, they risked causing severe injury or even pulling him apart. They could try to widen the passage using tools, but that would take time, and time was the one thing Brandon didn't have. Dr. Carter made a medical assessment based on Amy's description. If Brandon had been stuck inverted for 90 minutes, he likely had another 2 to 3 hours before the situation became irreversible. After that point, the damage to his heart and brain would be catastrophic, even if they managed to extract him. They had a narrow window, and they needed to use every second wisely. The decision was made to attempt a two-pronged approach. Some rescuers would work on carefully chipping away at the rock around Brandon's torso to create more space, while others would try to rig a pulley system to his feet so they could apply gentle, steady pressure to pull him backward. Both operations would require incredible precision. One wrong move, one piece of rock falling in the wrong place, or too much force on Brandon's body, and they could make things catastrophically worse. Back in the main chamber, the rescue team set up a ventilation system. They ran a flexible duct from a portable fan at the cave entrance all the way to the side passage, pumping fresh air toward Brandon. This served two purposes. It gave Brandon more oxygen, which he desperately needed, and it helped the rescuers working in the cramped, stale environment. The fan hummed to life, and a gentle breeze began flowing through the passage. Amy stayed with Brandon, talking to him constantly to keep him conscious and calm. She asked him about his life, his studies, his family. Brandon told her about his engineering classes, about his dream of designing sustainable buildings, about his little sister who was starting high school. He talked about how stupid he felt, how he'd ignored all the warning signs, how he just wanted to see his mom again. Amy listened, offering encouragement and reassurance, but inside she was deeply worried. Brandon's voice was getting weaker with each passing minute. His sentences were becoming shorter, more labored. The chest compression was taking its toll. Meanwhile, two rescuers, Mike Torres and another team member named Derek, carefully made their way through the Devil's Squeeze with rock hammers and small chisels. Their job was to reach the hourglass compression where Brandon was stuck and start carefully removing rock. But this was delicate, dangerous work. Cave limestone can be unpredictable. Sometimes it chips away easily. Other times it's as hard as concrete. And in a tight passage, there's always the risk of collapse. Every hammer strike had to be measured and controlled. It took Mike and Derek 30 minutes just to get into position. They set up a small LED work light, which cast eerie shadows on the rock walls, and began the painstaking process of chipping away at the passage. They started at the upper part of the hourglass, near where Brandon's shoulders were wedged. Each strike of the hammer produced a sharp crack that echoed through the passage. Small chips of limestone fell away, creating tiny piles of dust and debris. It was slow, exhausting work, and both men were acutely aware that Brandon's life depended on their precision. After 45 minutes of chipping, they'd managed to remove maybe 2 inches of rock from one side of the compression. It didn't sound like much, but in a passage this tight, every fraction of an inch mattered. Mike reached down and tried to assess whether Brandon's chest had any more room to expand. He pressed his hand against Brandon's back and asked him to try to take a deep breath. By 7:30 p.m., Brandon had been stuck for nearly 4 hours. The rescue team had been working non-stop, rotating shifts to conserve energy. Captain Morrison was in constant communication with Dr. Carter, who was monitoring Brandon's vital signs as best she could from a distance. Amy had managed to get a pulse oximeter on Brandon's ankle, and the readings were concerning. His oxygen saturation was at 89%, below the normal range of 95 to 100%. His heart rate was elevated at 115 beats per minute, a sign that his cardiovascular system was under severe stress. Dr. Carter made the call. "We need to escalate our efforts. If we don't get him out in the next 2 hours, we're looking at irreversible damage or death." Morrison relayed this to the team, and everyone understood what it meant. They had to work faster, but they couldn't afford to make mistakes. The pulley system was finally ready. 3 rescuers positioned themselves in the slightly wider section of the passage behind Brandon's feet, and they'd rigged a rope harness around his ankles. The idea was to apply slow, steady traction, pulling him backward while Mike and Derek continued to chip away at the rock. On Morrison's signal, they began to pull. The rope went taut, and for a moment, nothing happened. Brandon's body didn't budge. They pulled harder, and Brandon cried out in pain. "Stop! Stop! It hurts! My chest!" Morrison ordered them to release the tension immediately. The pulling was compressing Brandon's chest even more, making it impossible for him to breathe. This was the nightmare scenario. They couldn't pull him out without causing excruciating pain and potentially fatal chest compression. But they also couldn't leave him there. They were stuck between 2 impossible choices, and the clock was ticking. Dr. Carter consulted with Captain Morrison. "We need a different approach. The pulling is putting too much pressure on his thoracic cavity. We have to widen the passage first, enough that his chest can expand, and then we can attempt extraction." But Morrison knew what that meant. More time, more rock removal, and time was the one resource they were running out of. He made the call. "Focus all efforts on widening the hourglass. Forget the pulley system for now. We chip until we have enough space." Mike and Derek went back to work with renewed urgency. They brought in a 3rd rescuer, Lisa, who was small enough to fit into the passage and help with the rock removal. The 3 of them worked in shifts, one person hammering while the others rested and cleared debris. The sound of metal striking stone became a rhythmic pulse, a desperate countdown echoing through the cave. Each strike sent vibrations through the rock, and Brandon could feel every single one of them reverberating through his trapped body. By 8:15 p.m., Brandon had been inverted for nearly 5 hours. Amy, who had been with him almost the entire time, noticed a significant change in his condition. His responses were becoming slower, his words slurred. "Brandon, stay with me," she urged. "Tell me more about your sister." "What's her name?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Emma. Her name's Emma. She's going to be so scared when she finds out." Amy's heart sank. She'd seen this before, the gradual loss of coherence, the fading awareness. It meant his brain wasn't getting enough oxygenated blood. The inversion was taking its toll. She radioed Morrison immediately. "He's deteriorating fast. Altered mental status, delayed responses. We're running out of time." Morrison knew they were at a critical juncture. He gathered the team for a 60-second strategy session. "We have 2 options. 1, we continue widening the passage methodically, which could take another 2 to 3 hours. 2, we attempt a more aggressive extraction now, knowing it will cause him significant pain and possible injury, but it might be his only chance." Dr. Carter listened to the options and made a medical judgment. "If we wait 2 more hours, he'll likely be unconscious or worse. We have to try the extraction now, even if it's not ideal." The decision was made. They would make one final, coordinated effort to pull Brandon out. Mike and Derek had managed to widen the passage by approximately 3 inches at the shoulders and 2 inches at the rib cage. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. They positioned 4 rescuers on the rope system, the maximum number that could fit in the space. Amy stayed at Brandon's head, ready to monitor his condition during the extraction. Before they began, Amy leaned close to Brandon and spoke softly. "Brandon, we're going to pull you out now. It's going to hurt, probably a lot, but we need you to stay as relaxed as possible. Don't fight it. Let your body go limp. Can you do that for me? Brandon's response was barely a whisper. I'll try. Just please get me out. I want to see my family. Captain Morrison gave the signal. On 3. 1, 2, 3. Pull. The 4 rescuers pulled on the rope with steady, controlled force. The rope creaked under the tension. Brandon's body shifted slightly, maybe an inch, and he let out a guttural scream that echoed through the entire cave system. The sound was primal, filled with agony and terror, but his body was moving. They were making progress. Pull again, Morrison commanded. The rescuers heaved on the rope, their muscles straining. Brandon's body slid backward another inch, then another. He was screaming continuously now, a wordless cry of pain. Amy could see his legs trembling, his entire body shaking from the stress and agony. But they couldn't stop. Stopping now would mean leaving him in an even worse position, partially dislodged but still trapped. For 12 agonizing minutes, the team pulled in coordinated bursts, gaining inches at a time. Brandon's body scraped against the rough limestone, his shirt tearing, his skin abrading. Blood mixed with the mud and water on the cave floor. But slowly, impossibly, he was coming free. His hips cleared the tightest part of the compression, then his lower chest, then his shoulders. And then, at 8:47 p.m., Brandon Mitchell emerged from the hourglass passage. His body went limp immediately as the rescuers pulled him into the slightly wider section of the tunnel. Amy scrambled forward to assess him. His face was ashen, almost gray. His lips were blue. His eyes were half open but unfocused. She checked for a pulse at his neck. It was there, but it was rapid and thready, barely 140 beats per minute. His breathing was shallow and irregular. She started emergency medical protocols immediately. "Brandon, can you hear me? Brandon, stay with me." No response. She checked his pupils with a small pen light. They were dilated and sluggish to react. Not good. She radioed Morrison. "He's out, but he's in critical condition. Altered consciousness, cyanosis, tachycardia, respiratory distress. We need to get him to the surface immediately for advanced medical care." The extraction from the side passage became a race against time. 4 rescuers carefully but quickly moved Brandon's limp body back through the devil's squeeze. This was tricky because Brandon was unconscious and couldn't help maneuver himself, so the rescuers had to essentially drag him through, protecting his head and neck as best they could. It took 18 precious minutes to get him through that keyhole compression and back into the main passage. Once in the main passage, they placed Brandon on a lightweight rescue stretcher, a flexible canvas sling that could navigate tight spaces. 6 rescuers worked in relay, passing the stretcher through the crawl spaces, one person at a time moving it forward a few feet before the next person took over. Dr. Carter, who had been waiting in the larger chamber, immediately started an IV line in Brandon's arm, pushing fluids and medications to support his cardiovascular system. The journey to the surface was brutal. Every second counted, but they couldn't move recklessly and risk dropping the stretcher or injuring Brandon further. At 9:35 p.m., nearly 7 hours after Brandon had first entered that side passage, the rescue team emerged from Shadow Ridge Cave. An ambulance was waiting, its red and blue lights painting the forest in urgent colors. Paramedics Mike Torres and his partner immediately took over, loading Brandon into the ambulance. Caleb and Jessica, who had been waiting outside in a state of tortured anxiety, caught a glimpse of Brandon as he was loaded into the ambulance. He looked like a broken doll, pale and motionless, covered in mud and blood. Jessica collapsed into Caleb's arms, sobbing. Caleb just stared, unable to process what he was seeing. This was his best friend, and this was all happening because of a decision they'd made together. The ambulance raced toward Knoxville Medical Center, sirens wailing through the Tennessee night. In the back, paramedics worked frantically. Brandon's oxygen saturation was at 82%, dangerously low. His blood pressure was erratic, swinging between too high and too low as his body struggled to recover from the hours of inversion. They intubated him, inserting a breathing tube to ensure his airway stayed open and his lungs received adequate oxygen. When the ambulance arrived at the emergency room at 10:17 p.m., a trauma team was ready. Brandon was rushed into a resuscitation bay where doctors and nurses descended on him like a choreographed dance of medical expertise. They cut away his muddy, torn clothing. They inserted additional IV lines. They drew blood for lab work. They performed an ultrasound of his heart to check for damage. They ordered a CT scan of his brain to check for bleeding or swelling from the prolonged inversion. Dr. Sarah Kim, Brandon's heart had been severely stressed by the hours of fighting against gravity. His cardiac enzymes were elevated, indicating possible heart muscle damage. The CT scan showed early signs of cerebral edema, swelling of the brain tissue. His kidneys were struggling, showing signs of acute injury, possibly from the combination of dehydration, stress, and the hours of compromised blood flow. The medical team did everything they could. They administered medications to reduce the brain swelling, to support his heart function, to protect his kidneys. They placed him on a ventilator to ensure his breathing was adequate. They monitored every vital sign, every lab value, every subtle change in his condition. But the damage had been done. 7 hours inverted, chest compressed, unable to breathe properly, had pushed Brandon's body beyond its limits. At 11:43 p.m., Brandon's heart rhythm became unstable. Ventricular tachycardia, a dangerous rapid heartbeat that doesn't allow the heart to pump blood effectively. The medical team initiated CPR, shocking his heart with a defibrillator. Once, twice, 3 times. They pushed medications. They continued compressions. For 37 minutes, they fought to bring Brandon back. But at 12:20 a.m. on August 18, 2018, Dr. Kim made the call. Time of death, 0020. Brandon Mitchell was gone. In the waiting room, Brandon's parents, who had driven from Knoxville in a panic after receiving the call from police, sat holding each other. When Dr. Kim walked out to speak with them, she didn't have to say anything. They could see it in her eyes. Brandon's mother let out a sound that no parent should ever have to make, a wail of pure anguish that echoed through the sterile hospital hallways. His father just crumpled, his face buried in his hands. Caleb and Jessica were also in the waiting room, and when they heard Brandon's mother scream, they knew. Caleb stood up, walked to a corner, and threw up. The guilt, the horror, the sheer weight of what had happened crashed over him like a tsunami. Jessica sat frozen, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak or move. In the days that followed, the story of Brandon Mitchell's death made headlines across Tennessee and beyond. Cave accidents are relatively rare, but when they happen, especially to young people, they capture public attention. The news outlets ran with headlines like, "College student dies in Tennessee cave tragedy," and "Cave rescue turns fatal after 9-hour ordeal." Amateur cavers around the country read the story and felt a chill run down their spines. If you've ever felt the walls of a cave press against you, felt that moment of panic when you're not sure you can move forward or backward, you understand the nightmare Brandon experienced. But beyond the headlines and the news coverage, there were deeper questions. What went wrong? How could this have been prevented? The Tennessee Cave Rescue Team conducted a full debriefing, and their findings were sobering. Brandon Mitchell made several critical mistakes, each one compounding the last. He entered a cave with inadequate experience, equipment, and preparation. He deviated from the known, safe route to explore an unmapped passage. He went into a tight passage head first instead of feet first. He pushed forward into a narrowing passage instead of retreating when the walls began to close in. Any one of these mistakes alone might have been survivable. All of them together created a perfect storm of disaster. But here's the thing that haunts everyone who was involved in this case. Brandon wasn't reckless. He wasn't an adrenaline junkie taking stupid risks. He was a smart, capable young man who made a series of small, seemingly reasonable decisions that led to catastrophic consequences. He thought he was prepared enough. He thought the passage would be manageable. He thought he could handle it. And that's what makes this story so terrifying. It could happen to anyone who underestimates the dangers of cave exploration. The psychological impact on the survivors was profound. Caleb Rodriguez struggled with severe PTSD and survivor's guilt. He blamed himself for not stopping Brandon, for not being more forceful about turning back, for suggesting Shadow Ridge Cave in the first place. He stopped caving entirely and couldn't even look at pictures of caves without feeling panic. Jessica Palmer, who had been on her first and last caving trip, developed claustrophobia so severe that she couldn't ride in elevators or sit in the back seat of a car. She underwent therapy for years to process the trauma. The rescue team members, despite their experience and professionalism, were also affected. Amy Chen, who had spent those hours with Brandon in the passage, who had heard his voice grow weaker and more desperate, who had felt his pulse fade under her fingers, took a 6-month leave from cave rescue work. On the job, but there was something about Brandon's case that broke through those professional barriers. Maybe it was his age, maybe it was the length of the ordeal, or maybe it was the simple, heartbreaking fact that he'd been so close to getting out, but his body just couldn't hold on long enough. Shadow Ridge Cave was officially closed to the public after Brandon's death. The entrance was gated and warning signs were posted. The side passage where Brandon died, that unnamed tunnel that had seemed so inviting and adventurous, was sealed with concrete. It became a tomb, a memorial to the price of underestimating the underground world. Brandon's family established a scholarship fund in his name at the University of Tennessee, supporting engineering students who demonstrated not just academic excellence, but also safety consciousness and respect for natural environments. At the scholarship ceremonies each year, Brandon's father would speak briefly about his son, always ending with the same message. Adventure is wonderful. Exploration is human nature. But no adventure is worth your life. Know your limits. Respect the dangers. Come home safe. If you've made it this far in this story, you probably love extreme adventures as much as Brandon did. That curiosity, that desire to see what's around the next corner or through the next passage, is part of what makes us human. But Brandon's story should serve as a stark reminder. Caves don't care about your enthusiasm or your courage. They don't give second chances. The rock is indifferent to your struggle. And 9 hours inverted in a passage smaller than a coffin is a fate that should frighten anyone who ventures underground. The medical examiner's official cause of death was listed as positional asphyxia with contributing cardiac arrest due to prolonged inversion and chest compression. But the real cause, the root cause, was a series of preventable mistakes made by someone who didn't know what he didn't know. Brandon Mitchell died doing something he loved, but he died because he wasn't prepared for how quickly that love could turn into a nightmare. His story isn't just a tragedy. It's a warning. It's a lesson written in the language of consequence. And if it makes even one person think twice before entering that unmapped passage, before going in head first, before underestimating the darkness beneath the surface, then maybe, just maybe, Brandon's death can save a life. Every cave has a story. Shadow Ridge Cave now has Brandon's.